how 121 Rangers rescued more than 500 prisoners from a Japanese camp. In January 1945, the war in the Pacific had already changed direction, but it had not lost its cruelty. Japan was retreating, American forces were returning to the Philippines, the islands were again becoming battlefields, and military maps were filling with arrows of advance, supply lines, road names, rivers, and towns. For headquarters, this was the movement of a front. But for hundreds of men left behind the lines of war, it was something very different. Somewhere in the interior of Luzon, beyond Japanese posts, beyond roads where enemy reinforcements might move, beyond rice fields and villages, stood the prison camp of Cabanatuan. Inside it lived men who had already passed through hell once, and now did not know whether they would live long enough to be rescued. These men were American and Allied prisoners of war. Many had fallen into Japanese hands in 1942 after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. For them, the war had not begun with beautiful images of attack or triumphant orders, but with defeat, encirclement, hunger, heat, and the complete loss of control over their own fate. They had been soldiers of an army that fought until there was almost nothing left with which to fight, and then they became prisoners of an enemy whose treatment of captives often had little to do with what people usually call the rules of war. After the surrender on Bataan, thousands of prisoners were forced along a route that would later enter history as the Bataan Death March. It was not simply a movement from one place to another. It was a slow destruction of human beings by road, heat, thirst, beatings, disease, and the arbitrary violence of guards. Weakened soldiers were driven forward, and those who fell did not always rise again. Some died from exhaustion, some from dehydration, some from wounds, some from a blow or a shot. For the survivors, the march became not an episode from the past, but an inner wound that remained alive in the body and memory even years later. After the march came camps, transfers, sickness, forced labor, and endless waiting. Cabanatuan became one of the places where these men tried to survive day by day. In the camp, life narrowed to the simplest things: food, water, shade, medicine, the chance to lie down, the chance not to be beaten, the chance to wake up the next morning. A man who before the war had a home, a name, a profession, a family, and plans gradually became a number, a thin body, a participant in another roll call. The worst thing in captivity was not only physical suffering, but the destruction of time. The future disappeared. The past began to feel like someone else's life. Only the present remained, and in that present a man had to last a few more hours. By the beginning of 1945, many of these prisoners were so exhausted that even the thought of liberation seemed almost impossible. They heard distant rumors of the American advance, sometimes fragments of news reached them, and sometimes they noticed signs of anxiety among the Japanese guards. But hope in a camp was a dangerous thing. If a man believes too strongly in rescue and it does not come, that belief can break him faster than hunger. So many lived from morning to evening without allowing themselves to build a future. They were not waiting for victory. They were waiting for the next portion of food, the next day without punishment, the next night without a sudden order. Outside the camp, however, time was accelerating. American forces had landed on Luzon and were moving inland. Alongside them operated Filipino guerrillas who had resisted the Japanese occupation for years, gathering information, helping the Allies, and risking their families, villages, and lives. On paper, Japan still held large areas, but reality was changing. Japanese units were retreating, being shifted, losing steadiness, and that was exactly what made the fate of the prisoners of war so dangerous. A retreating enemy can be not only weaker, but harsher. When an army understands that it cannot hold ground, it sometimes tries to leave the enemy nothing: no stores, no bridges, no records, and no witnesses. That is why the threat to Cabanatuan was not abstract. American command already knew that Japanese troops were capable of killing prisoners when liberation seemed near. In December 1944, on the island of Palawan, a massacre occurred that became a terrible warning. There, American prisoners were forced into shelters under the pretext of an air raid, and then Japanese troops set those shelters on fire. Those who tried to escape were shot or killed. Only a few survived and were able to tell what had happened. After Palawan, any prisoner of war camp stopped being simply an objective that could be liberated later, when the front came closer. Every day of delay now meant a concrete possibility. The guards receive an order, gather the prisoners, isolate them, and kill them before the main forces arrive. So Cabanatuan became not only a point on a map, but a mission on which hundreds of lives depended. To liberate it through a normal advance was too risky. The front was moving, but not fast enough, and Japanese troops stood between the Americans and the camp. What was needed was an operation that resembled not an ordinary battle, but a surgical cut deep inside enemy territory. A small force would have to go where a large unit could not pass unnoticed, strike suddenly, destroy the guards, bring out sick and weakened prisoners, and then withdraw before Japanese reinforcements could gather and block the way. The task fell to the 6th Ranger Battalion of the United States Army. The Rangers were trained for fast, dangerous, unconventional action. They were expected to move silently, attack decisively, and operate in conditions where a mistake left no time for correction. But even for them, the Cabanatuan operation was almost insane in its difficulty. They had to go far behind the lines, into territory where Japanese units were present, where any encounter could ruin the entire plan, where one burst of gunfire too early could warn the camp and lead to the deaths of the prisoners. And most importantly, after the attack, the Rangers could not simply leave by themselves. They had to bring out hundreds of men, many of whom could barely walk. The raid was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, while the immediate planning of the assault was carried out by Captain Robert Prince. But this was not an American operation alone. Without the Filipino guerrillas, it could have ended in disaster before it even began. Local fighters knew the roads, villages, rice fields, Japanese posts, guard habits, local moods, and hidden paths along which a small force could be guided. They did not merely help as guides. They were part of the operation, its eyes and its shield. They were the ones who had to block roads, delay Japanese reinforcements, and cover the withdrawal with the rescued prisoners. At this point, the story becomes especially powerful because the rescue of Cabanatuan was not the work of one heroic rush. It was a complex bond among people who trusted each other in circumstances where trust could not be tested in advance. The American Rangers depended on the Filipino guerrillas. The guerrillas depended on the discipline of the Rangers. The prisoners depended on both, and success depended on whether each part would be done at the right minute. War often portrays heroism as a single act, but truly impossible operations usually rest on many people, each doing his part without unnecessary noise. Before the raid, reconnaissance had to understand what was happening inside and around the camp. Information came from guerrillas and local residents. The planners needed to know the number of guards, the positions of the barracks, fences, towers, gates, nearby Japanese units, routes of approach and withdrawal, and the condition of the prisoners. It was especially important to determine whether the camp was being evacuated or whether the Japanese guard force was preparing to kill the prisoners. For the Rangers, this meant that the plan had to be precise but flexible. In reality, a camp does not remain still like a training diagram. A sentry can change his route, a vehicle can appear on a road, prisoners can be moved, and a Japanese unit can be closer than expected. A real plan must account not only for what is known, but also for what may suddenly change. The Rangers moved toward the target not as an army marching to conquer territory, but as a shadow trying to slip between Japanese forces. They moved through fields and villages, trying not to raise alarm. Filipino guides helped them choose the route and avoid dangerous places. By day, they had to hide. By night, they continued moving. Every hour brought them closer to the camp, but every hour increased the risk. The farther they went behind the front line, the harder it would be to retreat if the plan failed. If the Japanese discovered the force before the attack, the Rangers might be cut off, and the prisoners might be killed before the rescuers ever reached the gates. Cabanatuan stood in open country, surrounded by rice fields. That made it dangerous for the attackers. In a forest, men can hide. In a town, they can use buildings. But in an open field, a man becomes visible, especially if the enemy is alert. The Rangers had to approach the camp unseen, and that meant crawling, waiting, freezing in place, blending into the earth, and counting on seconds. In such a moment, a man no longer thinks in fine words. He thinks about his breathing, the distance, whether metal has flashed, whether a branch has cracked, whether his head has risen too high. One of the most famous elements of the operation was the diversion made by an aircraft. An American plane was to fly over the camp and draw the attention of the Japanese guards, allowing the Rangers to move closer without being noticed. It was a simple but very subtle idea. War is often decided not only by the force of weapons, but by the direction of the human gaze. If a guard is looking upward, he sees the ground less clearly. If he is irritated or distracted by the noise of an aircraft, he may fail to notice movement in a field. If his attention is occupied by the sky, men crawling toward the camp receive a few precious minutes. Once the Rangers were in position, everything depended on timing. Some men had to strike the guards, others the towers, others rush toward the barracks, and others secure the exit for the prisoners. The Filipino guerrillas had to block possible routes of Japanese reinforcement. In operations like this, time compresses. Preparation can take days, movement can take hours, waiting can feel endless, but the attack itself is decided in minutes. If the first shots do not eliminate key points, the Japanese can react. If someone hesitates at the gate, the column of rescued men is delayed. If one section of road remains unprotected, the enemy may strike during the withdrawal. On the evening of January 30th, 1945, the attack began. For the prisoners inside the camp, it may at first have seemed like another outbreak of chaos, of which war had many. Gunfire, shouting, flashes, running figures, noise near the gate. None of this immediately formed into the understanding that rescue had arrived. A man who has lived for years in captivity cannot always believe in freedom in the first second. Many of the prisoners were also so exhausted, sick, or weak that they could not physically rise quickly and run. Some had to be told that these were Americans, that the camp was being attacked not to punish them, but to free them, and that they had to leave immediately because there was no time. This is one of the most dramatic moments in the entire story. The Rangers had not come merely to open gates. They had to pull men out of a state of camp existence. Imagine it this way. For years, a man has trained himself not to hope, because hope could destroy him. And now an armed soldier stands before him and says that he must move because freedom has truly come. But the body does not obey. The mind does not believe. The legs are weak, and a battle is still going on around him. For the rescuers, this was a test no less serious than the attack itself, because bringing out hundreds of exhausted men was harder than bursting into the camp with weapons. The Japanese guards were taken by surprise. The Rangers moved quickly and fiercely, destroying resistance inside the camp. But the danger did not disappear after the first minutes. The real problem began with the withdrawal. If nearby Japanese units managed to gather, the Rangers and the liberated prisoners would be extremely vulnerable. A small combat force could move quickly on its own, but now it had hundreds of men with it, some unable to walk without help. The speed of withdrawal dropped. The column became long, noisy, and difficult to control. Every sick man, every wounded man, every person who had to be supported under the arms or carried increased the risk for everyone. Here, the Filipino guerrillas and local civilians played a tremendous role. Guerrillas blocked roads, fought Japanese forces, delayed possible pursuit, and covered the retreat. Local people helped with carts, water, and support. In this operation, rescue was not only a military matter, but a human one. The liberated men did not simply have to be brought out of the camp. They had to be guided through dangerous territory. Some walked on their own, some leaned on comrades, and others were carried or transported. Men who that morning had still been prisoners were now moving through the night toward their own lines, and every step was both victory and danger. At moments like this, it becomes especially clear that the word rescue sounds beautiful only after everything is over. Inside the event, it does not resemble the triumphant ending of a film. It resembles exhaustion, dirt, fear, haste, other people's hands under shoulders, whispered commands, and the constant expectation of gunfire from the darkness. A liberated man is not yet free until he has left the danger zone. A ranger has not yet won until he has brought the prisoner to safety. A guerrilla has not yet finished his task until Japanese reinforcement has been delayed. The real victory of Cabanatuan was born not at the first shot, but in the long movement away from the camp, when hundreds of weakened men had to become a moving column of the rescued. The operation ended in remarkable success. More than 500 prisoners of war were liberated. The losses among the rescuers were small compared with the scale of the risk, although the operation was not without sacrifice. For the United States Army, it became one of the most daring and successful raids of the Second World War. For the liberated prisoners, it was a return from a world in which they had almost ceased to belong to themselves. For the Filipinos, it was another proof of their role in the fight for their own land, because without their participation, this story could have ended very differently. But to tell this story honestly, it cannot be turned only into a picture of American heroism. Yes, the Rangers carried out an extraordinary military achievement. Yes, they risked their lives by going deep into enemy territory for men they had never met. But beside them were Filipino guerrillas who had lived under occupation for years, knew the price of Japanese brutality, and continued to resist when the outside world often saw the Philippines only as one section of a vast war. These people were not secondary characters. They were part of the victory, and their contribution cannot be pushed into the background. Nor should the prisoners themselves be forgotten. Their heroism was of another kind. They did not storm the camp, plan the attack, or hold the road against reinforcements, but they endured years in which every day required inner resistance. Survival in captivity looks passive only to those who have never tried to understand what it means to live without freedom, food, safety, or a clear future. To preserve the mind, to support a comrade, to avoid losing the human self, to refuse inward surrender when outwardly almost everything has been taken away, that too is a form of courage. The raid on Cabanatuan became a story in which war revealed not only destruction, but an effort in the opposite direction. Usually military operations are aimed at capture, destruction, breakthrough, encirclement, or defense. Here the objective was different, to bring people back. Of course, it was a military task, performed with weapons and force, but its center was human. The Rangers did not go for territory, a supply depot, a bridge, or a symbolic building. They went for the men whom the enemy held behind wire and who could be lost forever if there was delay. That is why this story works so powerfully for a documentary film. It has a clear line of tension. The men in the camp may be killed, the rescuers must arrive in time, the enemy is near, the route is dangerous, and time is limited. But it also has a deeper inner meaning. It shows that sometimes the strongest military operation is not the one in which the most equipment is destroyed or the most ground is taken, but the one in which those who had almost been written off are saved. Cabanatuan reminds us that behind the word prisoners stand living faces, families, names, letters, homes, memories, and a hope a man tries to preserve even when it causes pain. After liberation, Many former prisoners returned to life slowly. A man does not walk out of a camp and become himself again in the same instant. The body remembers hunger, disease, and beatings. The mind remembers fear. Night sounds can carry a man back. Freedom arrives at once only on a map. Inside a person, it returns gradually. Yet for those brought out of Cabanatuan, the raid became the boundary between death and continued life. A few more hours, a few more days, or one order might have changed everything. Instead, men came in the night and risked themselves so that prisoners they had never met could become free again. If this story is imagined as one great scene, its beginning is quiet and heavy. Inside the camp are exhausted men who no longer expect miracles. Outside the camp is an advancing army, troubling rumors, and the fear that the Japanese will not leave the prisoners alive. Then a small force appears, too small for an ordinary victory, but determined enough for an impossible task. It moves through fields and villages, crawls toward the camp, waits for the signal, strikes in darkness, and opens the gates. Then comes the hardest part. Not winning the fight, but leading hundreds of weakened men across territory where death can still catch them at any minute. That is where the true power of the story is born. It is not that everything was easy and beautiful. On the contrary, it is that everything was difficult, risky, and capable of failing at any moment. One discovered track, one shot fired too early, one Japanese patrol, one delay at the barracks, one reinforcement on the road, and the ending could have been tragic. But on that January night, many people did exactly what they had to do. The Rangers attacked, the guerrillas covered them, local civilians helped, the prisoners found the strength to move, and the impossible became fact. The story of Cabanatuan is also important because it restores the human scale of war. Great wars often become numbers, divisions, corps, tonnage, kilometers, casualties, dates. All of that is necessary for understanding history, but sometimes numbers hide what matters most. More than 500 rescued men is not only a statistic. It is hundreds of lives continued. It is men who could see their families again, tell the truth about captivity, and live years that might have been stolen. Each life makes the operation not only a military success, but a moral victory. In this sense, the raid on Cabanatuan remains one of the most gripping episodes of the Second World War, not because it was the largest, but because it was almost impossible and yet perfectly understandable. The viewer does not need a complicated explanation of fronts and strategy to feel the stakes. There are men in a camp. They may be killed. A small force is going for them. It must arrive in time. That is enough to hold attention, but beneath the simplicity of the goal lies the enormous complexity of execution. When Cabanatuan is remembered today, the full picture matters. Exhausted prisoners of war, American Rangers, Filipino guerrillas, local civilians, reconnaissance, the night march, the diversionary aircraft, the sudden attack, the chaos of liberation, and the long withdrawal. This is not a legend of invincible heroes who easily did the impossible. It is the story of people who understood the risk and went anyway because delay might cost too much. Perhaps that is why the story sounds so powerful. There is no empty heroism in it. There is duty, there is fear, but there is action. There is weakness, but there is help. There is deadly danger, but there is the decision to move forward. In a world where war so often means loss, Cabanatuan became a rare episode in which military force was directed toward bringing people back to life. If one is looking for a story capable of holding a viewer for half an hour, not through invented dramatization, but through real tension, human stakes, and historical strength, the raid on Cabanatuan is one of the best choices. It was the night when a small force crossed enemy territory to open the gates of a camp. The night when men who had almost stopped believing in freedom heard that someone had come for them. The night when Filipino guerrillas and American Rangers did what had looked too risky on paper. And the night after which more than 500 men were no longer merely prisoners in a Japanese camp. They were human beings who had been brought back.